You might have noticed from your bulletin that that translation was rendered by Reverend Dr. Wilda Gaffney, who is a Hebrew Bible professor at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth. She, the lectionary passages that I'm using during Lent come from her volume called A Women's Lectionary for the Whole Church. And it's her selections of lectionary readings that either don't often get included in the traditional Revised Common Lectionary, with special attention to those that highlight women characters. And so it's Women's History Month. I thought it would be a good time to dabble in that lectionary. Really, the reason I chose these scriptures from Genesis is because I love her translations. If you noticed in the beginning of the passage that Gail read, she renders the Hebrew there that the serpent had more naked intelligence than any of the other creatures. The Hebrew there is a play on the word naked that shows up at the end of the previous passage, where it says that Adam and Eve were naked and unashamed. So she's really helping us to kind of see the imagery that's there in the Hebrew text. I was joking with some friends that if this sermon today had a soundtrack, it would be the song Breaking the Law by Judas Priest, which I only know because I'm married to Jonathan Zurcher, and it's one of our kids' favorite songs to rock out to in the car. It basically just is a repeat of breaking the law, breaking the law. But it's a good segue into our text for today, because our lives are governed by rules and norms. Whether they are the legal statutes that we commit to following in a civilized society, or the rules we follow at school or at work, or the rules we follow here in our faith community, some of which are explicit and formal, and some of which are kind of informal and unspoken. Kind of the classic church example is that people have their pews, right? And it seems like it doesn't matter whether it's a small church or a large church, people have their pews. And if you sit in someone's pew, you might not get kicked out right away, but you will probably discover somehow that you've sat in someone's pew. So I wanted to start with a little bit of audience participation and ask you to help me just to name some of the rules that we observe in our daily lives. And I thought I'd start with what are some of the rules, official and unofficial, that you have to follow when you're in school? Have any? K. Okay.
You have to wear clothes.
You have to wear clothes, okay? You have to wear clothes, and you have to stay in your seat, be quiet, and let the teacher talk.
Raise your hand.
And you're supposed to raise your hand if you do want to talk. Carolyn.
Get in line.
Yes, lots of getting in line. Rule. And don't keep your place and wait your turn. Joy.
Don't look on someone else's paper when you're taking a test.
Okay, yes, don't cheat off of someone's paper. And then like the version of that when you're in grad school is don't copy and paste somebody else's words without giving them credit, right? What about at home? Now these really could vary depending on the home. But I'm asking you to, self-disclose here as you feel comfortable. What are some of the rules in your home? Okay, take off your shoes. Lynn. Okay, don't talk to Lynn till she's had her coffee. Pat. What's that? Help. Help. Okay, like help each other. That's a great rule. Liz. Don't interrupt. Okay. We struggle with that one in our household. Gail.
If you don't do the cooking, then you have to wash the dishes.
Okay. I'm repeating this to make sure our people at home can hear, but if you don't do the cooking, you have to do the dishes.
The recycling and the recycling and the compost and the compost.
Okay. Recycling and recycling, compost and compost. Joy.
If you drop something like a container of milk, you must clean it up.
Okay, clean up your messes that you make. Carolyn. Put your clothes in the hamper. Yeah. Okay, now let's broaden that a little bit, well, a lot, to what are some of our national rules? And I'm not thinking so much of specific laws, but kind of, they could be laws, but what are some things that guide our life together that are American rules? Free speech, yeah. Pat. Help, okay. It's funny in this context, I feel like that's like a cry for help. Help, we need help. Okay, what else? Freedom of religion, yeah. Carolyn.
But it used to be stand up when you hear the national anthem.
Okay. That's a really great example because it will help us later in the sermon because that's a rule that's been contested in various ways for various reasons. Oh, Carolyn said it's a rule that you should stand at the playing of the national anthem. Okay, the right to bear arms. Another great example of a rule that is either contested or we interpret very differently depending on who we are. Joy.
Don't burn the flag.
Don't burn the flag. Right to a public education. Okay, now let's bring it to the context of our faith community. What are some of the rules here? And this could be either kind of churches in general, or you could even think of it as UCC churches, or you could think of it as this church in particular. Gail. Okay, thank you. Don't sit in someone else's pew. Carolyn.
You stay for the whole service.
Okay, you stay for the whole service.
In white Protestant churches, you sit quiet.
Okay, in white,
And you do not dance, clap, and shout during the songs.
okay, in white Protestant churches, you sit quietly and you do not shout, dance, or clap during the songs. Liz. Oh, okay. In this church, you do not put lacquer on the brass cross. I'm glad you said that one out loud, Sarah. Liz.
Just hear about it in the wider UCC. We respect each other's ways of living and moving.
Okay.
Often they're quite.
So in the UCC, Liz says we respect each other's ways of doing things, even if they're quite different from our own.
We also respect people of other faiths.
Okay, Dave says we also respect people of other faiths. Liz. Yeah. So in this space, Liz says we care about and for each other. Amy says we're a safe space for people who maybe are not finding safety in the world around us. Pat. We welcome each other. Joy.
I love it when you say no matter who you
Yeah. So we say we're open and affirming, which means no matter who you love or what your significant other relationships look like, you're welcome here. Liz.
We have a outside this
Yeah. We have a commitment to social justice and helping the least of these. I would add that we also have a rule about shared decision making. And that, that looks different in different scenarios, but it's not a hierarchical decision making kind of space.
Value question.
We value questioning. Well, y'all are obviously people who know and understand the rules. This story about the garden is at least in part a story about breaking the rules. The rule, as I'm sure you probably learned in Sunday school, if you went to Sunday school as a child, is that Adam and Eve have access to this whole garden of foods and resources that are ostensibly will meet their every need. And the only real rule that God establishes is that they're not allowed to eat the fruit from the tree that's in the center of the garden, which we call the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And we know from this story in Genesis 3 that they break the rule. The one rule, the one really important rule. Now, in the couple of millennia of Christian scholarship that has transpired since this early encounter in Genesis, people have opined in all kinds of ways about why Adam and Eve broke the rule and what were the consequences. Most of us here in the 21st century Western church, which has very much been influenced by the thinking of Augustine, have come away with an interpretation of this story that goes something like this. God's initial creation was perfect and whole in every way. And when Adam and Eve break the rule, which we tend to refer to as the fall, it disrupts and destroys that state of perfection. It breaks their covenant with God. And in the Christian tradition, the only thing that can restore that initial state of perfection is the work of Christ, and the work of Christ to redeem the world, a kind of second Adam who restores the created order to its initial perfection. Even if you couldn't really articulate that whole argument, I suspect that when someone raised to you the topic of the fall, you have an inclination to think, well, it was bad. Whatever happened, it was bad and it was wrong. But there's another interpretation of this story that goes way back, at least to the 2nd century, that was articulated by an early church father named Irenaeus. His most famous work is a volume called Against Heresies. So he's not a free thinker sort of outside the norms of orthodoxy. In fact, Pope Francis just named Irenaeus, I think, the 27th doctor of the church in January of this year. So he's very much within the mainstream of Christian orthodoxy. His interpretation is that Adam and Eve in the garden were essentially children. Maybe literally, but if not literally, at least spiritually and ethically. They are young humans. In fact, they're the first humans. So they're very much new to the activity of humaning. And as we discussed last week, God is also new at creating and shepherding humans. Maybe they're both kind of figuring things out together. Maybe this explains why God is so bad at baby-proofing the garden. Any parent knows that you don't put the one thing you don't want your children to touch in the center of their room. And any parent knows that the more you make something forbidden, the more desirable it becomes. Irenaeus goes on to assert that the fall was a necessary step in the evolution of humans toward higher or deeper levels of maturity and spiritual insight. That it just had to happen for us all to grow up. And yes, a lot of pain and suffering ensues in the aftermath, which we'll talk more about next week. But ultimately, for Irenaeus and many of the other first Christian communities, the fall was just the beginning of an evolutionary process of growth and understanding. If you think about the story that way, it makes sense what Dr. Will Gaffney suggests about the serpent. She suggests that we think of the serpent not as a tempter, not as some sort of precursor of Satan or the devil, but as the tester. The tester is the one who questions our assumptions, our narratives, the limits of our shared lives. In the garden, the serpent pushes Adam and Eve to be curious about God's prohibition against eating from the tree. Will you really die? He questions. Like right away or just eventually? If you eat from that tree, it will give you the knowledge of good and evil. Isn't wisdom something to be desired? In this context, if you think of the serpent as the tester and not the tempter, then Eve becomes the curious one, the one who's interested in exploring these questions. She's also the courageous one, the one who's willing to take that first bite of delicious fruit and find out, am I really going to die? Even Adam, who later becomes into sort of shame and blame and passing the buck, at least at this stage, he's willing to go along with this new adventure. Sort of changes the whole story altogether. You know, some violations of laws and norms are so harmful and egregious that they have the effect of breaking down trust and mutual commitment altogether. We are seeing this play out on the international stage in Ukraine every day, where Vladimir Putin has really abandoned all norms for engagement. But other times, when someone has the courage to violate communal norms, it has the potential of opening us all up to new possibilities for growth. Either because these norms are somehow unfair or unjust, or maybe because they no longer make sense for our time. We need folks like the serpent who are able to question the truth of our narratives. We need folks like Eve who have the courage and curiosity to act in new ways. We even need folks like Adam who will go along with a new plan, even if they're nervous and not quite ready to take responsibility. We've been forming our transition team here at the Congregational Church. I passed on to them an article about transition teams to kind of guide our work together. It was written by Tom Green and Paul Ryder. And this is one of the things they say about congregations and change. Congregations are full of change survivors. That is, some people who live through change without actually changing. In order to change, people must think, feel, or do something differently from what they thought, felt, or did previously. If what they're saying is correct, at the end of our transitional period, if we are not somehow changed, we will have done it wrong. This is a perfect time to ask ourselves, why? Why do we do the things the way we do them? Do our core narratives about who we are as a church or as a nation actually hold up under scrutiny? To quote the serpent, if we sample new fruits, will we really die? Or may we perhaps be reborn into something more mature, beautiful, and new? The pandemic has given us a lot of time and a lot of scenarios, forced us to ask these kinds of questions. In the U.S., more and more of us are questioning the idea that healthcare is a privilege and not a right. And this is pushing us closer to some kind of universal healthcare system, which we desperately need. In Texas, we are questioning whether having an independent power grid cut off from neighboring states will really keep us warm in the winter. Thanks to the protest around racial justice and police reform, many jurisdictions are eliminating or reducing the use of no-knock warrants, which have been shown to have devastating consequences. We need people who will sometimes violate the rules and norms and provoke us to new ways of thinking and being. The example that Carolyn gave about the national anthem is a perfect example of that. Some people don't stand for the national anthem. Some people don't even sing the national anthem because of their convictions about separation of church and state. And some people take a knee during the national anthem because of our country's history of racial injustice. When we are living in community with one another and someone violates our norms, we always have a choice. In some cases, we will need to reassert the boundaries for the well-being of everyone. In other cases, we will need to take a step back and wonder, what new opportunity is available to us to grow again and become wise? May it be so. Amen.